Priya Kapoor had spent most of her adult life learning to read her mother the way sailors read weather, watching for the small shifts in barometric pressure that meant a storm was building long before any rain actually fell. Sunita Kapoor didn't yell, didn't slam doors, didn't do anything a casual observer might identify as controlling. Her particular talent was subtler than that, a gift for reshaping reality so gradually and so plausibly that by the time you noticed something had shifted, you'd already half convinced yourself it had always been that way. Priya's father, Ravi, moved through the marriage like a man perpetually a few steps behind a conversation he'd once understood, deferring to his wife on nearly everything with the particular exhausted compliance of someone who'd learned, decades ago, that disagreeing with Sunita cost more than it was ever worth. Priya had grown up in a house in the Chicago suburbs that looked, from the outside, like the picture of a successful immigrant family's achievement, a large colonial with a manicured lawn, a driveway that held 2 clean cars, a mother who chaired charity galas and sat on the board of the local Indian Cultural Association, a father who'd built a comfortable career as an actuary. Inside, the house operated according to an unspoken but rigidly enforced hierarchy of appearances, where Priya's job, from as early as she could remember, was to reflect well on the family in ways that were never quite articulated but were always, somehow, understood. Good grades. The right extracurriculars. A carefully curated set of friends whose families Sunita approved of. By the time Priya reached college, she developed a low-grade, permanent hum of anxiety about disappointing her mother that she wouldn't fully recognize as unhealthy until years of therapy in her late 20s finally gave her the language for it. She'd gone to school 4 states away, partly for the program, a strong urban planning department that genuinely excited her, and partly, if she was honest with herself, because the distance offered a kind of relief she hadn't realized she needed until she actually had it. She built a life there slowly, tentatively, the way someone tests weight on a leg that's been in a cast for a long time. She made friends her mother had never vetted. She took a job after graduate school with a city planning department, work she found genuinely meaningful, work her mother described to relatives as something with the government. I don't fully understand it, in a tone that made clear she decided, without ever saying so directly, that it wasn't impressive enough to brag about properly. She met Nathan 3 years before the wedding, at a friend's barbecue in the small city, where she'd settled after grad school. He taught high school chemistry and coached the cross-country team, drove a decade-old Honda he maintained meticulously himself, and had a way of listening to her that felt, in the early months of dating him, almost disorienting in its steadiness. No games, no strategic silences, no subtext she had to decode. He was kind in a plain, unshowy way that Priya had never quite encountered before, having grown up around a particular brand of performed warmth that always seemed to have conditions attached. She'd known, bringing him home for the first time 2 years into the relationship, that her mother would find something to object to. She just hadn't predicted exactly what shape the objection would take. Sunita had been polite to Nathan's face, unfailingly, gracious in the specific, chilly way she reserved for people she'd already decided didn't belong, complimenting his tie, asking careful questions about his family, offering him seconds at dinner with a warmth that never quite reached her eyes. It was only afterward, in the kitchen while helping clear dishes, that Sunita had said to Priya, quietly, almost conversationally, "A teacher, Priya. You went to graduate school for this." And Priya, 30 years old and still somehow bracing for her mother's approval like a much younger woman, had felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. The objections continued in various forms over the following 2 years, comments about Nathan's modest salary, about the fact that he didn't own property, about how some families value ambition differently than others, and that's fine, but you should think about what you actually want long-term. Priya had absorbed each comment, turned it over, weighed it against what she actually knew of Nathan, his steadiness, his genuine delight in his students, the way he remembered small details about her life that even she sometimes forgot she'd mentioned, and had decided, each time, that her mother was wrong. When Nathan proposed, on a hiking trail they'd walked together dozens of times, Priya said yes without a shred of hesitation, and called her parents that same evening, already braced for a muted response. Sunita's reaction to the engagement had been, on the surface, Entirely appropriate. Congratulations offered, plans discussed. A venue eventually agreed upon after several rounds of negotiation over budget and guest list that Priya recognized, even then, as a kind of ongoing skirmish for control dressed up as practical planning. But something in her mother's manner had shifted subtly over the months that followed, a coolness that Priya couldn't quite name but could feel, the particular quality of a person going through motions while quietly working on something else entirely behind the scenes. She didn't find out what that something else was until 3 weeks before the wedding, on a Tuesday evening in October, when Nathan called and asked if he could come by after his last class instead of waiting until the weekend, his voice carrying a strain she'd rarely heard from him. He arrived at their apartment looking pale, moving with a careful, deliberate stiffness, and sat her down at their small kitchen table, the one they'd bought secondhand and refinished together the first year they'd lived together, a table that had hosted 100 ordinary dinners and now suddenly felt like the site of something much larger. "I need you to just tell me the truth," he said, his hands folded in front of him, not quite meeting her eyes. "Whatever it is, I can handle it. I just can't handle not knowing." Priya felt something cold uncoil in her stomach, some animal instinct recognizing danger before her conscious mind had caught up. "The truth about what?" "About the baby, Priya." His voice cracked slightly on the word, and she watched him steady himself before continuing. "Your parents told me. They came by my classroom on their lunch break last week, said they needed to talk to me alone without you there. They said you had a daughter when you were 20, that you gave her up at a hospital and never looked back. They said that's why there's this whole gap in the stories you tell about your early 20s, the years between sophomore year and grad school that you always sort of skip over." Priya sat very still, the kitchen suddenly feeling too bright, too loud in its silence. She was 31 years old. She had never been pregnant in her life, not once, a fact so basic and so obviously verifiable that for a moment she almost laughed. The accusation was so absurd, until she registered the genuine anguish on Nathan's face, the way his hands were trembling slightly where they rested on the table, and understood that whatever her parents had shown him had been convincing enough to actually frighten him. "None of that is true," she said, hearing her own voice come out thin and strange. "I have never had a child. I don't understand why they would say that. They showed me a photo." Nathan's voice was barely above a whisper now. "A hospital bracelet. A bassinet tag. They said they'd been keeping it quiet all these years to protect you, to protect your reputation, but that they couldn't in good conscience let me marry into it without knowing. They looked so sad telling me, Priya. They looked like it was breaking their hearts to say it." Priya thought of every gala her mother had chaired, every fundraiser, every performance of gentle, wounded concern she'd watched Sunita deploy over the years against relatives, neighbors, anyone whose narrative needed reshaping to fit whatever outcome her mother had already decided on. She thought, with a clarity that arrived almost calmly beneath the panic, that she was looking, for the first time, at exactly how far her mother was willing to go. "I need to see the photo," she said. "Whatever they showed you. I need to see it right now." Nathan pulled out his phone with hands that weren't quite steady, scrolling to a photo he'd apparently taken a screenshot of during that lunchtime meeting in his classroom, and turned the screen toward Priya across the kitchen table. She leaned in, forcing herself to look carefully rather than recoil, and found herself staring at an image of a hospital bassinet identification tag, the kind hospitals use to label newborns, a small plastic card with a name, a date, a set of measurements. The name had been blurred, deliberately and just precisely enough to remain plausible without being fully legible, a detail that struck Priya immediately as strange. Real evidence didn't need selective blurring. Fabricated evidence did. "Can you send this to me?" she asked, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her something physical, a tightness settling behind her sternum. "I need to look at it closely." He sent it. Priya opened the image on her own phone and zoomed in, studying the edges, the lighting, the particular grain of the photograph, and something in the back of her mind began to itch with recognition, not of the specific image, but of its texture, its composition, something familiar in the exact soft-focus lighting and generic hospital backdrop that felt less like a candid photo and more like stock photography she'd seen used somewhere before, in some other context entirely. "Nathan," she said slowly, I believe that you believe this is real. I need you to believe me when I tell you it isn't. I have never been pregnant. I have never had a child. I can prove this to you, but I need time, not weeks of doubt hanging over us, but enough time to actually show you, with real evidence, that this is fabricated. Can you give me that? Can you not call anything off, not tell anyone else, until I have a chance to show you? Nathan sat with that for a long moment, his jaw working, and Priya watched him wrestle visibly with two competing instincts: the trust he'd built with her over 3 years, and the raw, disorienting shock of watching two people he'd been taught to respect as her parents present something so specific, so seemingly documented, with such practiced sorrow. Okay, he said finally quietly. Okay, I want to believe you. I do believe you, I think, but I need to understand why they would do this, if it isn't true. I need something that makes sense of it. Give me until the rehearsal dinner, Priya said.
Please.
3 weeks. I'll show you everything. She didn't sleep much that night, lying awake beside Nathan in the dark, her mind already moving into a mode she didn't fully recognize in herself. Cold, methodical, stripped of the reflexive deference she'd spent 31 years cultivating toward her mother. Something had shifted permanently in her the moment she'd seen Nathan's face at that kitchen table. Some final thread of hope that her mother's controlling instincts had limits finally, completely severed. She started the next morning with the photo itself, running it through a reverse image search the way she vaguely remembered doing once for a work project, uncertain it would actually turn up anything but unwilling to leave any avenue unexplored. It took less than 10 minutes. The bassinet photo, stripped of its blurred name tag, matched almost exactly to a stock image she found on a medical photography licensing site, tagged under categories like newborn care and hospital maternity ward, available for a modest fee to anyone who wanted to license it for a brochure or a website or, apparently, a fabricated family scandal. That discovery alone might have been enough, but Priya kept digging, some old instinct telling her that if her mother had used this exact image before, there might be a trail. She spent 2 evenings scrolling through years of digital archives from the Hospital Foundation Gala her mother had chaired for nearly a decade, an annual fundraiser Sunita treated with the seriousness of a state dinner, and found it on the 4th attempt, a program from 6 years earlier, a glossy PDF still hosted on the Foundation's outdated website, featuring a full-page spread about the hospital's maternity ward renovation fund. The exact same bassinet photo sat at the center of the page, watermarked faintly in the corner with the name of a stock photography agency, credited beneath in small print that Sunita, as gala chair that year, had almost certainly approved personally before printing. Priya sat staring at her laptop screen for a long time after finding it, feeling something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, some third thing she didn't have a clean name for, the specific vertigo of discovering, with hard evidence, that a person who is supposed to love you unconditionally had instead treated you as a problem to be engineered around, using tools she'd apparently kept on hand for exactly this kind of occasion. She widened her search after that, no longer confining herself to the photo alone. She requested her own medical records from the 2 clinics she'd used during her early 20s, both in the college town where she'd done her undergraduate degree and the city where she'd attended graduate school, receiving back, within a week, official documentation confirming no pregnancies, no deliveries, nothing beyond the ordinary run of checkups and a broken wrist from a rock climbing accident her sophomore year. She called her college roommate, Farah, who still lived in the same city and readily agreed to write and notarize a statement confirming Priya's whereabouts and activities during the specific 18-month window her parents' fabricated timeline implied. Farah remembered it easily, since it overlapped with the semester they'd shared a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, and Farah had, if anything, teased Priya for years about how uneventful and studious that entire stretch of her life had actually
been.
It was during this process, calling around to old contacts and gathering documentation, that Priya reached out to her cousin Mira almost as an afterthought. Not because she suspected anything, but because Mira had always been close to her growing up, and Priya found herself wanting, in the middle of this strange and lonely excavation, to talk to someone in the family who might actually understand the particular flavor of Sunita's control, without Priya having to explain it from scratch. The conversation started as comfort and turned, within 20 minutes, into something else entirely. Priya, working her way carefully around the specifics of what was happening, mentioned only that her mother had done something manipulative, involving fabricated information, without yet detailing what. Mira had gone quiet on the other end of the line and then said, slowly, Priya, this is going to sound like it's coming out of nowhere, but do you remember Daniel? From my junior year of college? Priya did remember, vaguely. A boyfriend Mira had dated for the better part of a year, someone she'd seemed genuinely happy with, whose sudden and unexplained disappearance from Mira's life had always struck the family as one of those private ruptures nobody quite got the full story on. He broke up with me out of nowhere, Mira said. He wouldn't really explain why, just kept saying he'd heard some things and needed space. I always assumed it was something about me, some insecurity of his own, and I never really got to the bottom of it. But my mom mentioned, years later, almost in passing, that Auntie Sunita had run into his mother at some event and mentioned something about a shoplifting arrest, like it was old news, like it was something everyone already knew about. I never got arrested for anything, Priya. I don't know where that would have even come from. Priya sat with the phone against her ear, the pieces settling into a shape she hadn't been prepared for, a pattern extending backward through years she'd never thought to examine. Mira, she said carefully, I think our mothers might have more in common than we realized. I think I know exactly where that story came from. She didn't tell Mira everything that day, not wanting to overwhelm her with the full scope of what was unfolding before Priya herself had finished building the case, but she asked, gently, whether Mira would be willing to talk more about it later, and whether she'd come to the wedding. Mira, sounding shaken but resolute, said yes to both. The 3 weeks leading up to the rehearsal dinner passed in a strange, suspended tension for Priya, functioning normally in front of her parents at 2 increasingly surreal dinners where Sunita made pointed, sympathetic comments about honesty and healing, about how some things are hard to talk about, sweetheart, but Nathan deserves the truth, and so do you, really, deep down. Each comment landing on Priya like a hand testing for a wound that hadn't quite finished forming. Priya smiled through these dinners, offered non-committal responses, gave her mother absolutely no indication of what she'd already assembled, understanding with a cold clarity that any early confrontation would only give Sunita room to maneuver, to reframe, to find some way of making Priya's anger look like instability rather than justified fury. She printed everything in the final week, the stock photo comparison, the gala program with its faint watermark, her medical records, Farah's notarized statement, a simple timeline laid out in clean, unemotional language. She arranged with the restaurant hosting the rehearsal dinner to set up a small screen near the head of the table, telling the manager only that she had a brief presentation to share during the evening, a detail vague enough not to raise questions. She told Nathan everything the week before, sitting him down at the same kitchen table where he'd first brought her the accusation, walking him through each piece of evidence slowly and carefully, watching relief and fury move across his face in equal measure as the full shape of what her parents had done finally became clear to him. He held her hand for a long time after she finished, not saying much, and then said quietly, I should have known. I did know somewhere. I just didn't want to believe 2 people could do that to their own daughter. Priya didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure, even now, that she fully believed it herself, despite every piece of evidence sitting in the folder in front of them. She reached out to Mira one final time before the dinner, asking if she'd be willing to sit near Priya's side of the family rather than her usual distant seat, without explaining fully why, and Mira, sensing something significant was coming, agreed without pressing for details. By the night of the rehearsal dinner, Priya had everything organized in a slim folder, backed up in triplicate across her phone, her laptop, and a printed copy tucked into her bag, and she arrived at the small Italian restaurant with a calm that surprised even her, not the frantic, anxious calm of someone bracing for confrontation, but something steadier, the particular quiet of a person who has done the work, gathered the truth, and is finally, after 31 years, ready to stop absorbing whatever story her mother decided to tell about her.